The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday afternoon, turning the busy downtown streets into a maze of puddles and rushing water. Most people were hurrying to find shelter, clutching their umbrellas tight and watching their step. But not everyone had that luxury. Alexander King sat behind the wheel of his brand-new sports car, the kind that cost more than most people make in 5 years. The leather seats still had that fresh smell, and every surface gleamed with perfection. At 28 years old, Alexander had never worked a day in his life, never had to worry about money, never had to think twice about buying anything he wanted. His father owned half the tech companies in the city, and Alexander lived like a prince because of it. But today he wasn't feeling very royal. He was angry, really angry. His father had just finished giving him a lecture that lasted 2 hours. Something about responsibility and making better choices. The old man had cut his monthly spending money in half after Alexander crashed his expensive boat during a party last weekend. $50,000 a month instead of $100,000? Can you believe it? How was he supposed to live on so little? Alexander gripped the steering wheel tighter as he remembered his father's disappointed face. The rain kept falling, making everything look gray and miserable, which matched his mood perfectly. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, making the engine roar as he sped through the streets. Other drivers honked at him, but he didn't care. Let them honk. He had places to be and people to see. As he approached the main intersection near the shopping district, Alexander noticed the traffic light turning yellow. He should have slowed down, but instead he pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The car shot forward like a rocket, and that's when he saw her. An old woman was trying to cross the street. She looked to be in her 70s, maybe older, with gray hair that hung down to her shoulders. Her clothes were old and patched up in several places. She carried 2 worn-out shopping bags that looked like they might fall apart at any moment. The rain had already soaked through her thin jacket, and she was moving slowly, carefully, like every step was difficult. Any normal person would have stopped to help. Any decent person would have at least slowed down to let her cross safely. But Alexander wasn't feeling normal or decent. He was feeling mean and angry, and he wanted someone else to feel bad too. He spotted a huge puddle right next to the crosswalk. The storm drain was blocked, so the water had collected there, deep and dirty and full of mud from the street. A wicked smile spread across Alexander's face as an idea formed in his mind. Instead of stopping or even slowing down, he turned his car straight toward that puddle. The woman, whose name was Rose Blackwood, was halfway across the street when she heard the engine getting louder. She looked up just in time to see the expensive car heading right for the water beside her. Her eyes went wide with fear, but there was nowhere to run. She was too old, too slow, and the car was too fast. Alexander hit that puddle at full speed. The water exploded upward like a geyser, a massive wave of dirty, cold liquid that crashed down on Rose like a waterfall. Every inch of her got soaked. In an instant. Her shopping bags flew out of her hands, spilling their contents all over the wet pavement. A loaf of bread that was probably her dinner rolled into the gutter. Some canned food scattered across the street. Dented and dirty, Rose stood there in shock, water dripping from her hair, her clothes completely ruined. She looked like she had been thrown into a river. The few other people on the street stopped and stared, their mouths hanging open. Some pulled out their phones, but Alexander didn't care about that either. He rolled down his window and stuck his head out, laughing like he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Hey, old lady!" He shouted over the sound of the rain and traffic. "Maybe next time you'll watch where you're going. Stay off the street if you can't afford to get wet." Rose just stood there, trembling. It wasn't from the cold water, though that was making her shiver too. She was shaking with something else entirely. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her eyes had a strange look in them, like they were seeing things that weren't there. Alexander didn't notice any of that. He was too busy laughing at his own cruel joke. He revved his engine again, making it roar loud enough to scare a nearby pigeon into flight, and then he sped away. His expensive car disappeared around the corner, leaving Rose standing alone in the middle of the intersection, but Rose wasn't really alone. A few kind strangers came over to help her. A young man in a delivery uniform helped her pick up her scattered groceries, though most of them were ruined now. An older woman offered her a towel from her purse, though it was small and didn't do much good. A teenager with purple hair gave her $5 and told her to get something warm to drink. Rose thanked them all quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes never stopped watching the direction where Alexander's car had gone. Those eyes held secrets that would have terrified the young man if he had bothered to stick around and look. You see, Rose Blackwood wasn't just any ordinary old woman trying to make her way in a tough world. She had been alive for more than 200 years, though she looked like she was only 70. She had learned magic when the world was very different, when people still believed in things they couldn't see or touch. She had the power to do things that would sound impossible to most people, but Rose didn't use her powers for herself. She lived simply, quietly, helping people who really needed it. She had enough magic to make herself rich, to make herself young again, to live in a mansion instead of a tiny apartment. But she chose not to. She believed that power should be used to help others, not to make life easier for yourself. Still, there were limits to her patience. And watching that young man laugh at her pain, seeing him speed away without a care in the world while she stood there soaked and humiliated, those limits had been reached. Rose bent down and carefully picked up what was left of her groceries. The bread was ruined, the milk carton had split open, and most of her vegetables were scattered too far to find. It would be another hungry night for her, but she had survived worse. As she walked slowly toward the sidewalk, water still dripping from her clothes, Rose began to whisper words in a language that was old when the pyramids were young. Her voice was so quiet that no one could hear her over the rain and traffic, but the words had power anyway. "Pride comes before a fall," she whispered, her breath making little clouds in the cold air. "And some falls are harder than others." The rain kept coming down, washing the street clean, but it couldn't wash away what had just happened. And it definitely couldn't wash away what was about to happen next. 3 hours had passed since Alexander splashed Rose with that dirty water, but he had already forgotten all about it. That's how his mind worked. Other people's problems just disappeared from his thoughts like they never happened at all. Right. Now he was standing in his huge penthouse apartment, getting ready for the most important night of his social calendar. The charity gala at the Grand Hotel was tonight, and everyone who mattered would be there. Politicians, business owners, celebrities, and of course, all the rich families like his own. Alexander needed to make a good impression because his reputation had been getting worse lately. The boat crash was just the latest in a long line of expensive mistakes, and people were starting to talk. His walk-in closet was bigger than most people's bedrooms, filled with suits that cost more than a car. Alexander picked out his favorite, a black designer suit that had been custom-made just for him. The price tag had said $15,000, but he never really looked at price tags anyway. Money was just numbers to him, numbers that never seemed to run out. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his gold cufflinks and making sure every hair was perfectly in place. The mirror was huge, surrounded by bright lights like something you'd see in a movie star's dressing room. Alexander loved looking at himself in it. He had always been told he was handsome, and he believed it completely. But tonight, something was different about his reflection. At first, he thought it was just the lighting playing tricks on him. The face looking back seemed to flicker, like a television with bad reception. For just a split second, he could swear he saw someone else's eyes staring back at him. Old eyes, tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much. Alexander blinked hard and shook his head. When he looked again, everything was normal. It was just his own face, young and confident and perfectly groomed. He laughed at himself for being so jumpy. Maybe he had been drinking too much lately. His father was always telling him to cut back on the expensive wine. Meanwhile, across the city in a part of town that Alexander had never visited and never would, Rose was sitting in her small apartment. The place was nothing like Alexander's penthouse. The walls were thin, the heating barely worked, and you could hear every car that drove by on the busy street below. But Rose had made it her own over the years. The apartment was filled with things that most people would find strange. Old books with leather covers and pages that looked like they might crumble if you touched them. Candles of every size and color, some burned down to almost nothing. Dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, filling the air with scents that were both sweet and mysterious. Crystals and stones scattered on every surface, each one carefully chosen for its special properties. Rose had changed out of her wet clothes and into a long, dark robe that she only wore for special occasions. This was definitely a special occasion. She had spent 200 years learning to control her temper, learning to be patient with people who didn't understand the world the way she did. But today that patience had run out. She moved around her small living room, gathering the items she would need for what came next. A silver bowl that had belonged to her grandmother's grandmother, a handful of herbs that she had grown herself. On the tiny balcony outside her window, 3 white candles that had never been lit before tonight. And most importantly, a small piece of paper where she carefully wrote Alexander's full name in ink that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. Rose had seen Alexander's license plate when he drove away, and it hadn't been hard to figure out who he was. The King family was famous in this city. Their pictures were always in the newspaper, usually at fancy parties or cutting ribbons at new buildings. Alexander's father owned technology companies that employed thousands of people. The family had more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes, but money couldn't protect Alexander from what Rose was about to do. She arranged the candles in a triangle on her small wooden table and lit them one by one. The flames danced and flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Rose opened one of her oldest books, its pages yellow with age, and found the spell she was looking for. The words were written in a language that had been old when the Roman Empire was young, but Rose could read them as easily as if they were written in English. "He who shows no kindness shall learn kindness through suffering," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "He who believes money makes him better than others shall discover what it truly means to have nothing." She sprinkled the herbs into the silver bowl and watched as they began to smoke, filling the air with a scent like flowers and lightning. The smoke rose in spirals, forming shapes that seemed almost like faces before dissolving back into nothing. "Alexander." "King." Rose said his name 3 times, each time a little louder than the last. On the 3rd time, the candle flames all leaned toward the center of the table, as if blown by a wind that wasn't there. Back in his penthouse, Alexander was putting on his expensive watch when he felt the first real sign that something was wrong. It started as a dizzy feeling, like he had stood up too fast after lying down for a long time. The room seemed to spin around him, and he had to grab onto the edge of his dresser to keep from falling. "What the heck?" he muttered, blinking hard and trying to focus. The dizzy feeling passed after a few seconds, but it left him feeling uneasy. Alexander had always been healthy, never got sick, never had problems like this. He decided it was probably just nerves about the gala, but as he walked toward his front door, ready to leave for the party, he caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. And what he saw made him freeze in place, his heart suddenly beating. Much faster than it should, for just a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds. He saw a completely different person looking back at him. An old woman with gray hair and tired eyes, wearing a wet, patched jacket instead of his expensive suit. The woman's mouth was moving like she was trying to tell him something, but no sound came out. Alexander stumbled backward, bumping into the wall behind him. When he looked at the mirror again, his own reflection was back to normal. Young, handsome, perfectly dressed for the party. But his hands were shaking now, and sweat was starting to form on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered to himself. "This is crazy. Mirrors don't do that. People don't just see other people in mirrors." He tried to convince himself that it was just stress, just his imagination playing tricks on him. Rich people didn't have problems like this. Rich people had doctors and medicine and solutions for everything. Whatever was happening, money could fix it, but deep down, in a part of his mind that he didn't like to listen to, Alexander was starting to realize that some problems couldn't be solved with money. Some problems were bigger than bank accounts. And family names and expensive cars. Rose was still sitting at her table, watching the candle flames dance in patterns that told her the spell was working perfectly. She could feel the magic reaching across the city, finding its target, beginning to wrap around Alexander like invisible chains. "The lesson begins now," she whispered to the flickering shadows on her walls. "And it won't end until you understand what you've done." The 3 candles burned lower, and somewhere across town, Alexander's world was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Alexander woke up to the sound of car horns honking and people shouting outside, but that was impossible. His penthouse was on the 40th floor of the most expensive building in the city. He had paid extra to make sure his bedroom was soundproof. No street noise should be able to reach him up there. He tried to open his eyes, but everything felt wrong. His eyelids felt heavy, like they weighed 100 pounds each. When he finally managed to get them open, he was staring at a ceiling he had never seen before. It was low and stained with brown watermarks that looked like they had been there for years. The paint was peeling in several places, and there was a crack running from one corner all the way to the middle. Alexander tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Every muscle ached like he had been hit by a truck. His back felt like someone had been using it as a punching bag all night. His hands looked strange too, wrinkled and spotted with age, marks that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. Panic started to creep up his throat like cold water. This had to be a dream, the worst nightmare he had ever had. Any second now, he would wake up in his own bed, in his own room, and everything would be back to normal. He pinched himself hard on the arm, harder than he ever had before. It hurt, really hurt, but nothing changed. The room around him was tiny, maybe the size of his walk-in closet back home. There was a small bed with sheets that had seen better days, a rickety wooden chair, and a dresser that looked like it belonged in a yard sale. The walls were painted a sad yellow color that had faded to almost white. A single window looked out onto a busy street where cars rushed by without stopping. Alexander forced himself to stand up. Even though his legs felt like they might give out at any moment, each step toward the dresser was painful and slow. When he finally reached the small mirror sitting on top, he looked into it and let out a scream that came from the very bottom of his soul. The face staring back at him was not his own. It was the face of an old woman, the same woman he had splashed with dirty water just yesterday. Her gray hair was messy from sleep. Her skin was wrinkled and spotted with age, and her eyes looked tired and sad. When he opened his mouth to scream again, her voice came out instead of his own. "No, no, no, this isn't real." He shouted, but it sounded like an old woman having a breakdown. "This is impossible. People don't just switch bodies. This doesn't happen in real life." He grabbed the mirror and shook it, like maybe that would fix whatever was wrong with it. But the reflection didn't change. The old woman's face just looked back at him with growing horror. Alexander dropped the mirror, and it shattered on the floor into a dozen pieces. Each shard showed him the same impossible truth. He was somehow trapped in Rose's body. Meanwhile, across the city in Alexander's penthouse, Rose was having a very different morning. She woke up in the most comfortable bed she had felt in decades. The sheets were softer than clouds, and the mattress seemed to cradle her entire body. For a moment, she almost forgot what she had done the night before, but when she sat up and looked at her hands, she remembered everything. These weren't her old, wrinkled hands. These were young hands, strong hands, hands that had never done a day of hard work. She stood up slowly and walked to Alexander's bathroom. Looking at herself in his huge mirror, Alexander's face looked back at her, but with her own wise eyes behind it. She touched his cheek, feeling how smooth and young the skin was. His dark hair was thick and healthy, nothing like her own gray locks. His body felt strong and full of energy, the kind of energy she hadn't felt in 50 years. "Interesting," she said in Alexander's voice, which sounded strange coming from her lips. "Very interesting indeed." She was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. Alexander's assistant was calling about his schedule for the day. There were business meetings, lunch appointments, and something about a photo shoot for a magazine. Rose listened carefully, learning about the life she was temporarily living. "Tell them I'll be there," she said, trying to sound like Alexander, "but I want to make some changes to my schedule first." Back in Rose's tiny apartment, Alexander was having the worst day of his life. He had tried everything he could think of to prove this was all just a horrible dream. He had splashed cold water on his face, slapped himself, even tried to go back to sleep, hoping he would wake up normal. Nothing worked. When he looked in Rose's little purse, he found exactly $3.47. $3.47. Alexander spent more than that on a single cup of coffee every morning. He had never in his life had to worry about money, had never even looked at a price tag before buying something. Now he was looking at less than $4 like it was the most important thing in the world. His stomach was growling, but he didn't know how to cook anything. At home, he had a personal chef who made all his meals. When he went out, he ate at expensive restaurants where other people brought him food on fancy plates. He had never had to figure out how to feed himself with only a few dollars. Alexander decided he needed to get back to his building and somehow prove who he really was. Surely the doorman would recognize him, even if he looked different. He would explain what happened, and they would help him figure this out. Rich people had doctors and lawyers and all kinds of smart people who could solve any problem. But when he tried to leave Rose's apartment, he discovered that walking in her body was much harder than it looked. Every step hurt. His back ached constantly, like someone was pressing on his spine. His knees felt like they might give out without warning. Going down the stairs was scary. He had to hold on to the railing tight and take each step very slowly. The walk to his building took almost an hour. Even though it should have been a 15-minute trip, Alexander had to stop and rest several times because he kept getting out of breath. People on the street looked right through him like he was invisible. A few times, people bumped into him and didn't even say sorry. He was just another old woman that nobody cared about. When he finally reached his building, Alexander felt a wave of relief. This was home. This was where he belonged. The doorman, a big man named Tony, who had worked there for 10 years, would definitely recognize him and help him get back to his apartment. "Tony!" Alexander called out as he approached the glass doors. "Tony, it's me. It's Alexander. I know I look different, but I can explain everything." Tony looked down at him with confusion and then annoyance. "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about. You need to move along before I call security." "No, you don't understand." Alexander was getting desperate now. "I live here. I'm Alexander King. My apartment is on the 40th floor. I can prove it. Ask me anything about the building." But Tony just shook his head and stepped in front of the door. "Look, I've seen you around here before asking people for money. I'm not falling for whatever game you're trying to play. Mr. King is a young man, and you're just some old woman trying to cause trouble. Please, you have to believe me." Alexander was almost crying now. "Check the security cameras. Look at my ID. I can tell you my social security number, my bank account information, anything." "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave, and then I'm calling the police," Tony said firmly. "I don't want to make trouble for you, but I can't have you bothering the residents." Alexander stood there on the sidewalk, staring up at his own building, watching Tony close the door firmly in his face. Through the glass he could see the fancy lobby where he had walked 1,000 times before. He could see the elevator that went up to his penthouse, the mailboxes where his name was written in gold letters, the expensive furniture that he had never really noticed before. But now he was on the outside, looking in. Just another old woman that nobody wanted around? For the first time in his life, Alexander understood what it felt like to be completely powerless, to have no one believe you, to be invisible to the world around you. As he walked slowly away from his building, his body aching with every step, Alexander began to realize that this wasn't just a nightmare he would wake up from. This was real, and somehow he was going to have to figure out how to survive in a world that he had never bothered to understand before. 5 days had passed since Alexander woke up in Rose's body, and each day had been harder than the last. He was learning things about life that he never knew existed, things that money had always protected him from understanding. Meanwhile, Rose was making changes to his life that would have shocked anyone who knew the real Alexander. Rose stood in Alexander's office, looking out the huge windows at the city below. She was wearing one of his expensive suits, but somehow it looked different on her, more humble, more thoughtful. Alexander's personal assistant had been confused by his sudden interest in charity work. But Rose didn't care about confusion. She had work to do. "Cancel my lunch at the country club," she told the assistant in Alexander's voice. "Instead, I want to visit the downtown homeless shelter. And call my accountant. I need to set up some large donations to food banks around the city." The assistant blinked in surprise. The old Alexander would never have visited a homeless shelter, let alone donated his precious money to help poor people, but she nodded and started making the calls anyway. Rich people were allowed to be strange, she figured. Rose had been busy since taking over Alexander's life. She had already paid off medical bills for 3 families who were struggling. With debt, she had quietly donated money to help a single mother keep her apartment. She had even convinced Alexander's father to give raises to all the workers in their companies, who were earning the least money. But the most important thing Rose was doing was learning about Alexander himself. She read his emails, looked through his photos, talked to his friends. What she found was exactly what she expected, a young man who had never learned to care about anyone but himself. Because no one had ever taught him how. Meanwhile, Alexander was getting his education in the hardest way possible. That morning, he had woken up in Rose's tiny bed with his stomach growling so loud it sounded like a wild animal. He had eaten the last of Rose's food 2 days ago, a can of soup that tasted like water and a piece of bread that was starting to get moldy around the edges. Alexander had never been hungry before, not really hungry. Sure, he had skipped meals when he was busy partying or shopping, but he had always known that food was just a phone call away. Now, with only $2 left from Rose's small amount of money, every bite mattered. He forced himself to get dressed in Rose's old clothes, which hung loose on her thin frame. The sweater had holes in it that someone had tried to fix with patches, and the shoes were worn down so much that he could feel every crack in the sidewalk when he walked. But these were the only clothes Rose had. So these were the only clothes he had now. Alexander had heard about a place called the Community Kitchen that served free meals to people who couldn't afford food. The idea of eating free food, of standing in line with homeless people and begging for a meal, made him feel sick with shame. But his stomach was hurting so much that he didn't have a choice. The walk to the community kitchen took him almost an hour because he had to stop and rest so many times. Rose's body was old and tired, and Alexander was learning that being old meant everything took longer and hurt more. His feet were covered in blisters from Rose's worn-out shoes, and his back ached from sleeping on her lumpy mattress. When he finally reached the community kitchen, Alexander was shocked by what he saw. There was a long line of people waiting. Outside, men and women of all ages, some with children, some alone. They didn't look like the scary homeless people he had imagined. They looked like regular people who had just run out of luck. Alexander joined the end of the line, feeling embarrassed and scared. He had never stood in line for anything in his life. Rich people didn't wait. They got what they wanted immediately. But here he was, just another person hoping for a free meal. The man in front of him turned around and smiled. He was probably 50 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes. His clothes were clean but old, and he carried a small backpack that looked like it held everything he owned. "First time here?" the man asked gently. Alexander nodded, not trusting his voice. He was afraid that if he started talking, he might start crying, and he didn't want to cry in front of strangers. "My name's Robert," the man said. "Don't worry, the people here are good folks. They'll take care of you. I'm Rose," Alexander managed to say. Remembering that was the name, everyone would know him by now. Robert started telling Alexander his story as they waited in line. He had been a construction worker for 20 years, working hard and saving money for retirement. But then he got hurt on the job, injured his back so badly that he couldn't work anymore. The medical bills ate up all his savings, and when he couldn't pay rent, he lost his apartment. "I never thought I'd be standing in line for free food," Robert said with a sad smile. "But life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" Alexander listened to Robert's story with growing amazement. This man had worked hard his whole life, had done everything right, and still ended up homeless through no fault of his own. Alexander had never worked a day in his life, had never earned a single dollar. And yet he had lived in luxury while Robert slept on the streets. When they finally got inside the community kitchen, Alexander was surprised again. The volunteers serving food were smiling and friendly, treating everyone with respect and kindness. No one looked down on the people in line or made them feel ashamed for needing help. A woman with gray hair and gentle hands served Alexander a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. "Here you go, dear," she said warmly. "There's more if you're still hungry." Alexander found a seat at one of the long tables next to Robert and a few other people. The soup was simple, just vegetables and broth, but it tasted better than any fancy meal he had ever eaten at expensive restaurants. Maybe it was because he was really hungry for the first time in his life. Or maybe it was because it was made with love instead of money. As he ate, Alexander listened to the conversations around him. People were sharing stories, offering to help each other find jobs or places to sleep. A young woman was tutoring a teenager with his homework. An older man was sharing his medicine with someone who couldn't afford to buy their own. These people had almost nothing, but they were sharing what little they had with each other. Alexander had always had everything, but he had never shared anything with anyone unless it benefited him somehow. After the meal, Robert invited Alexander to come with him to the park where some of the homeless people gathered during the day. Alexander was nervous about going, but he didn't have anywhere else to be. Rose's tiny apartment felt like a prison. And at least with Robert, he didn't feel completely alone. The park was different from what Alexander expected. Instead of dangerous people doing scary things, he found a small community of individuals who looked out for each other. They shared blankets when it got cold, shared food when someone found extra, shared information about where to find work. Or help. Alexander met Lisa, a woman about his real age who had been living on the streets for 6 months after losing her job and her apartment in the same week. She was smart and funny, and she spent her days looking for work while also helping elderly homeless people who were too sick or tired to take care of themselves. He met Carlos, an older man who had been a teacher before he got too sick to work. Carlos still carried books in his backpack and would read to anyone who wanted to listen, turning a park bench into a classroom for people who had never had the chance to finish school. These people were showing kindness and generosity that Alexander had never seen in his wealthy friends. His rich friends only cared about other rich people, only helped others when it made them look good or when they could get something in return. As the sun started to set, Alexander realized something that shocked him. Despite being hungry, despite being tired and sore and scared, despite having almost no money and nowhere comfortable to sleep, he felt something he had never felt before in his privileged life. He felt like he belonged somewhere. Not because of his money or his family name or his expensive things, but because people like Robert and Lisa and Carlos had welcomed him simply because he was another human being who needed help. For the first time since this nightmare began, Alexander started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was learning something important. Something that all his money and education had never taught him. Something about what it really meant to be human. 2 weeks had passed since Alexander's world turned upside down, and the man who woke up in Rose's tiny apartment that morning was completely different from the one who had splashed an old woman with dirty water just 14 days ago. The change wasn't just in his mind, it was in his heart, in his soul, in the very way he saw the world around him. Alexander sat on the edge of Rose's small bed, looking at his reflection in the cracked mirror she kept on her dresser. The face staring back was still old and wrinkled, still tired and worn down by years of hard living. But the eyes were different now. They held something they had never held before, understanding. He had spent the previous night helping Robert find a warm place to sleep when the temperature dropped below freezing. He had shared his last dollar with Lisa so she could buy medicine for her cough. He had listened to Carlos read poetry to a group of homeless teenagers who had never heard anyone say that their lives mattered. For the first time in his privileged life, Alexander had felt truly useful, not because of his money or his family name, but because he had chosen to care about other people. It was a feeling he never knew existed, and now he couldn't imagine living without it. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Alexander struggled to his feet, his body still aching from sleeping on the hard mattress, and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was Rose, but she was in her own body again, looking exactly as she had that day when he splashed her with water. "Hello, Alexander," she said quietly, her old voice gentle but serious. "May I come in?" Alexander's heart started beating faster. Somehow, he had known this moment would come, but he still wasn't prepared for it. He stepped aside and let Rose enter the tiny apartment that had been his home for 2 weeks. Rose looked around the small space with sad eyes. She saw the empty food containers that Alexander had been saving because he couldn't bear to throw anything away anymore. She saw the notebook where he had been writing down the names and stories of all the people he had met on the streets. She saw the worn-out blanket that he had been sharing with others even though it meant he would be cold at night. "I know what you're thinking," Alexander said, his voice shaking slightly. "You're thinking that I've learned my lesson and now I want my old life back. You're thinking that I'm going to promise to be better and then go right back to being the same selfish person I was before?" Rose sat down in the small wooden chair, the only chair in the room, and folded her hands in her lap. "What are you thinking, Alexander?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the right words. "I'm thinking that I was never really alive before. I had everything: money, cars, houses, clothes, food, anything I wanted. But I never had what Robert has, or Lisa, or Carlos, or any of the people I've met these past 2 weeks." "And what is that?" Rose asked. "Purpose," Alexander said simply. "They have purpose. They care about something bigger than themselves. Robert looks out for the younger homeless people, even though he has nothing to give them except kindness. Lisa spends her time helping elderly people, even though she's struggling just as much as they are. Carlos teaches kids to read, even though he doesn't have a home or a classroom." Alexander sat down on the bed across from Rose, his eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "I never cared about anyone but myself. I never helped anyone unless it made me look good. I never even noticed that people like you existed. Until I became you." Rose studied his face carefully, using senses that went far beyond normal human sight. She could see into his heart, into his soul, and what she found there was genuine. The change in Alexander wasn't just surface deep. It went all the way to his core. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered, and the words came from the deepest part of his being. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you that day. I'm sorry for every homeless person I've ignored, every poor person I've looked down on, every time I've used my money to make myself feel superior to others. I'm sorry for wasting 28 years of my life being a terrible human being." "What would you do differently if you could go back?" Rose asked. Alexander had been thinking about this question for days. "I would use my money to help people instead of just buying expensive toys for myself. I would learn the names of the people who work for my family instead of treating them like they're invisible. I would volunteer at places like the community kitchen. I would remember that having money doesn't make me better than anyone else, it just makes me luckier." Rose nodded slowly. "And what if I told you that you could have your old body back, but you could never tell anyone what happened to you? What if you had to keep this experience secret forever?" "I wouldn't care," Alexander said immediately. "I don't need anyone to know what I learned. I just need to live it." Rose stood up and walked to the small window that looked out onto the busy street. Down below, she could see people hurrying to their jobs, rushing to their appointments, focused on their own lives and problems. Most of them never noticed the homeless people sitting on the sidewalks, never saw the elderly people struggling to cross the street, never paid attention to anyone who couldn't help them get what they wanted. The magic that switched our bodies can only be undone by genuine understanding and true repentance, Rose explained, turning back to face Alexander. "For 2 weeks, I've been watching you through ways that you wouldn't understand. I've seen you share food when you were hungry, give money when you had almost none, comfort people when you were hurting just as much as they were." "You've been testing me," Alexander realized. "I've been giving you the chance to prove that people can change," Rose corrected. "Most people in your position would have spent these 2 weeks feeling sorry for themselves, complaining about how unfair life was, demanding that someone fix their problems. But you chose to help others instead. Rose moved to the center of the small room and closed her eyes. She began to whisper words in that ancient language Alexander had heard once before. The night this all began, at this time the words sounded different, hopeful instead of angry. Healing instead of punishing, a warm, golden light began to fill the room, starting as just a tiny spark and growing brighter and brighter until Alexander had to close his eyes. He felt a strange, tingling sensation all over his body, like every cell was being gently rearranged. The constant aching in his back and knees began to fade away. His breathing became easier, deeper when the light finally dimmed and Alexander opened his eyes. He was looking down at his own young hands again. He was back in his own body, 28 years old, strong and healthy. But he felt completely different from the last time he had been in this body. He felt lighter somehow, like a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Rose was still there, back in her own elderly body, smiling at him with genuine warmth. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Grateful," Alexander said without hesitation. "Grateful for everything, for this second chance, for the people who showed me kindness when I had nothing to offer them, for learning what really matters in life. And grateful to you for caring enough about me to teach me this lesson, even after what I did to you." 6 months later, Alexander's life looked nothing like it had before. He had sold his expensive sports car and bought a simple, reliable vehicle that he used to deliver food to homeless shelters. He had moved out of his penthouse and into a modest apartment in a neighborhood where he could actually know his neighbors. He had started a foundation that provided job training and temporary housing for people experiencing homelessness. Most importantly, Alexander had kept every promise he made to Rose that day in her tiny apartment. He learned the names of everyone who worked for his family's companies. He volunteered at the community kitchen every week, serving food alongside the same woman who had first fed him when he was hungry. He visited Robert and Lisa and Carlos regularly, not as a rich person doing charity work, but as a friend who genuinely cared about their lives. His wealthy friends thought he had lost his mind. His father worried that he was throwing away the family fortune, but Alexander had never been happier or felt more alive. He had discovered something that all his money had never been able to buy, a sense of purpose that came from making other people's lives better. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 6 months after his transformation, Alexander was back at that same intersection where everything had started. But this time he was there by choice. He had set up a small table with free coffee and sandwiches for anyone who needed them. When he saw elderly people trying to cross the busy street, he helped them safely to the other side. Rose watched him from across the street, invisible in the crowd of people rushing past. She smiled as she saw Alexander help an old man with his heavy grocery bags, offer an umbrella to a woman caught in the rain without one, and hand a warm meal to a homeless teenager who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. The magic was complete. Alexander had learned what it truly meant to be human, and he would never forget it. Rose's work here was done, but she knew that Alexander's real work, the work of living with compassion and purpose, was just beginning. And in a world that often seemed to have forgotten the importance of kindness, that was the most powerful magic of all.